Hi. This is a very different talk than I usually give. I usually give technical talks about technical topics, but this is more of a musing about programming. Or programming as a practice, programming as a discipline, programming as a career. I'm Paul Betts. I work at GitHub. I evoke feedback. And my screen name on Twitter and GitHub and everywhere else is Paul Betts with X's around it, because in high school I thought that was cool, and now I'm stuck with it. And there's that. So what is programming? Like, how should we model how we think of ourselves as a discipline, right? So there's a lot of different approaches on how you could do that, right? So a lot of people think of ourselves as engineers, right? So when you go to university, you usually get a degree in computer science engineering, right? And so while that's really useful and convenient in a lot of ways, or effective, I find that for me it doesn't do it for me. It doesn't really match how I think of what I do. Engineering is really about optimization problems, right? We want to solve a problem with these constraints, and those constraints are maybe business constraints, or time constraints, or physical constraints, right? It's like, well, we live on a planet with gravity, so we should probably account for it. But optimization problems are really not that exciting to me. They're really just, solving a puzzle, and I think programming is a little bit more than that. And the other thing about engineering is that, at least for most engineering, when the city calls you up and says, we want to build a bridge, you don't go to work inventing a new kind of bridge, right? You just find the bridge out of the list of bridges that other people have built, and sketch out how long it needs to be, and then you work out a project plan, right? You're building things that have mostly already been done. Now, of course, somebody had to figure out how bridges are built, right? But it's probably not you as an engineer, right? Most of the time, you're going to choose what has already been done. But with programming, it's kind of unique because everything we build is something that has not already been done. Because if it's already been done, you just copy it, right? Like, building programs are always something pioneering, always something unique, right? So engineering doesn't really fit how I think of being a programmer. So is it business? It's like, well, I like that even less. Because business is really about, like, in my mind, and maybe a lot of people would disagree, business is about competition. It's about winning, right? Like, you're trying to make more money than all the other people. You have stockholders to tell your earnings to, and you're trying to make as much money as possible, right? And I never was really into competition. Didn't do sports in school or do any of these things. I never was really excited about it. And the other thing is that certain, at least in things like finance, or like this term financial engineering, right? You don't really create anything. What do you end up at the end of, like, figuring out this algorithm to trade 3 million stocks into 3 million other different stocks, right? Did you really make anything? Or did you just move stuff around? Now, of course, if you're an economist, you're saying that that's silly, and you're efficiently allocating the means of production, blah, 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 blah. It's not exciting to me either. So how can we solve this conundrum? So I theorize, and I will put this out to the audience and try to prove it in the rest of this talk, that what we do is more like this, or maybe like this. So this is my friend Marcy. So when I went to university, instead of living with the computer science people, I lived with the art kids and the modern dancers and the graphical designers, because I checked the wrong box in high school. But I actually really enjoyed that. I actually didn't check the wrong box, because when I was in high school, I did music for 8 years. I played a whole bunch of different instruments, and I really didn't know whether I wanted to be a computer scientist, which I was really good at it, or a programmer, or a musician, right? So I would have been way cooler if I was a musician, but I'd also be way broker. So I guess it turned out, right? Or maybe we're like these people. This is Slater Kinney. I don't know them, sadly. This is Mark Rothko, the famous abstract artist. I don't know him either. So I theorize that programming is way more like being a painter, or an artist, or a dancer, or musician, or a bass player, or Eddie Vedder. Maybe a little less like Eddie Vedder. So art is about human expression through language, right? And so that language may be very different, right? Programming is expression through language. Art is an expression through language. Music, dance, they're a medium to communicate an idea, right? A way through some form to put what's in my head into your head, right? And you can express any idea using any medium, right? But certain mediums are more suitable than others, right? So dance as a medium is very abstract. It struggles to be concrete. It's always interpreted in a very metaphorical way, right? The paintings are very concrete. They struggle to be abstract, right? Everyone looks at the frame and says, this is what this is, and then metaphor is something you have to fight for in a painting, right? So this is, some of you may recognize him, some of you may not. This is a famous Ruby programmer called Y the Lucky Stiff. And so that's his kind of his official name, right, or his name that he goes by or went by. And so he used code in a very unique way. He really used code more like poetry than how we use code, right, in a very structured way. And I think that's really neat. So when we write code, we're always trying to think under very practical constraints, right? Like performance, maintainability, and he kind of didn't care about those. What if you didn't care if somebody was going to use your code afterwards? And so it ended up that his code was incredibly difficult to maintain, right? Because you'd read it afterwards and it'd just be crazy, and you'd be like, who wrote this? This is insane. But it made people think differently. So his claim to fame is a book that he wrote called Y's Poignant Guide to Ruby. So Y was really interested in teaching people how to program. That was his mission. He was really interested in teaching kids and people in school how to learn to find the joy that he found in coding. And so he could have done that by writing a tutorial. He could have done that by putting up a website, a guide online. But he wrote a comic book. And so it's really hard to read, but this book is all like this. It's very quirky and, as he says, poignant. So he had an idea, but he expressed it in a very different way than you or I would express it. So when I want to become a better programmer, think about programming, or think about what I do, I like to read books that aren't about programming, about software engineering. They're kind of neat, but I think other books I find more applicable things to me. I like to read books about art and design. So I thought I'd mention a few things that I learned from these books. So like programming as a profession has existed for like 50 years, maybe, right? 50, 60. Art, design, sculpture, architecture, at least 2,000 years, right? There's people who've been putting a lot of thinking around what it means to be a designer, what it means to be an architect, and we can learn from them. So if you saw this book and you went to art school, you'd be groaning right now because this is like the lamest book that they hand out as a textbook in every first-year class, and you would think that it was the least cool thing in the world. But I thought it was really cool because I had never seen it before. So I'm going to read you a few quotes that I found from this book and other books related to it. So what you need to know about the next piece is contained in the last piece. The place to learn about your materials is in the last use of your materials. The place to learn about your execution is in your execution. Put simply, your work is your guide, a complete, comprehensive, limitless reference book on your work. So I read this and I think to myself, it's like, well, if I want to learn something or get good at something, I shouldn't read books about it and I shouldn't take classes. Maybe I should take classes, but really what I should do is just do it, right? And work on it and work and try and practice, right? I thought that was really valuable and interesting. This is another quote. Art is a high calling. Fears are coincidental. Coincidental, sneaky, and disruptive, we might add, disguising themselves variously as laziness, resistance to deadlines, irritation with materials or surroundings, distraction over the achievement of others, indeed as anything that keeps you from giving your work your best shot. What separates artists from ex-artists is that those who challenge their fears continue. Those who don't quit. So at this point you may be saying, it's like, well, that doesn't, we're not really painters, right? This is kind of bullshit. I've got deadlines and I've got managers. Well, I don't, but maybe you do. And you'd be right. We're not quite like painters or sculptors, right? Their goal is solely to create something something that expresses an idea, right? And something moving, or really something that they can sell. Our work also has concrete goals and constraints, like engineering, right? So code usually does something, right? It's not always just solely for interest's sake, right? So what about architecture, right? So architecture has kind of the same thing, right? So these are some buildings by Frank Gehry. And so these buildings, people have to live in them or go to them. They have to do stuff. Like you can't just do whatever you want, right? You live within constraints, but within those constraints you can be very creative, right? It's aesthetic and functionality. So here's another example. So this is armchair number 51F, designed by Walter Gropius, who's one of the founding members of Bauhaus. One of the people I lived with, or a lot of the people I lived with, were industrial designers. So and when I say industrial, I don't mean like in a factory. I mean like product design, like things that are physical, right? And so they're really their symbol. If you had to think of one symbol for industrial design, is a chair, right? So chairs are both very aesthetic, right? There's all kinds of different chairs and all kinds of different styles, but at the same time, they have constraints and goals. Like you have to fit a person-shaped thing in that chair, right? And they have to be comfortable. So you can't just do anything. So here's another designer. This is a graphic designer. His name is Paul Rand. And so he is famous for logo design. Logo design is one of the hardest things to do in design because it has to be very versatile. It has to express essentially an entire company inside a picture, which is very, very difficult. Let's see if you recognize a few of his logos. So this is the Westinghouse logo, right? This one you'll probably recognize. This one's an easy one. The funny thing is, you're probably thinking right now, that logo is pretty bad. That's not that great. And so he actually writes about this. At first, when you make a logo, your feelings about the company come from the logo, right? You see the logo, and if it's cool, you're like, oh, that company's cool. But eventually, it switches the other way around. Your feelings about the logo are now your feelings of the company, right? And so IBM's been around for a long time, and this logo has been around for a long time. So really, if you don't like this logo, it's probably because you don't like IBM. So here's another example. It's really similar, but you can see it both has the metaphor and the callback to the original, right? So we wrote a really great collection of essays called Design, Form, and Chaos. And I found a lot of really interesting things in that book. I'm going to read you more quotes, because you guys can't read. No, that's not true. But I'm going to read it anyway, because I like it. Design is the fusion of form and content, the realization and a unique expression of an idea. Design entails a whole-part relationship expressed in terms of facture, space, contrast, balance, proportion, pattern, repetition, scale, size, shape, color, value, texture, and weight. These are the means. Unity, harmony, grace, and rhythm are the desirable ends. I thought that was really interesting. And so he quotes somebody else in this book. To be modern is not a fashion, it is a state. It is necessary to understand history, and he who understands history knows how to find continuity between that which was, that which is, and that which will be. So the moral of the story is, I guess, learn C. So Paul Rand had a lot of really interesting thoughts on design and what it is to be a designer, but he also thought a lot about the relationship between design and business. So what it means to be a professional designer, what it means to be a professional. So some of you may remember this logo or have seen it before. This is the Next logo, right? Steve Jobs, after he got booted out of Apple, formed this company called Next, right? And so Next did some really stuff that took the rest of the world about 20 years to catch up to. It's pretty revolutionary if you look back and think they came up with this in the 80s. This technology is the base for OS X and iOS to this day. If you've ever done Objective-C, you remember NS string. NS stands for next step, right? Just from Next. So Steve Jobs gave this interview back in the 90s, and he asked Paul Rand to design a logo for his company, right? This is a big deal. And so he asked Paul, he said, well, can you give me a couple of options? And so Paul Rand said, no, I won't. I'm going to solve your business problem for you, and you're going to pay me. So he recognized the design, and what he did was not only an artistic endeavor, it was a means to solve a business problem. So what has kept the designer and a client at odds is the same thing that's kept them in accord. For the former, design is a means for invention and experiment. For the latter, a means of achieving economic, political, or social ends. So this is how Paul Rand thinks of the professional relationship between design and business. I thought that was pretty interesting. So this is another great book that I think is a pretty good programming book. This is about juxtaposed pictorial images in deliberate sequence, also known as comic books. Can everyone read this text? I'm not sure if they could. Yeah? No? Maybe? I can't fix it now. It doesn't really matter, but it's just curious. So there's a lot of interesting things I found in this book that kind of made me think about code. So this frame is about abstraction, right? And so he says that abstraction, making something simpler, not only is actually more difficult, it makes your idea stronger, right? Because in the left one, that person on the left has 2 eyes and a mouth, right? But as you cut down the detail, each detail becomes stronger, right? When you eliminate what's superfluous, then only the details you want to call out remain. So I think it was pretty interesting. Programs always deal in abstraction. That's what we do. It's computer science is the study of complexity and order, right? So we had this other comic which I really like. And so Scott McCloud, his theory of what is art, art is anything that does not involve survival or reproduction, right? So we see this caveman, and he's being chased by a lion, right? He's at the edge of the cliff. He jumps on the tree, and the lion jumps off the cliff, and he lives, right? But he could, the next thing he could do is go eat, or maybe go make a baby, because what else are you going to do if you're a caveman? But instead, he blows his tongue at the tiger. So that's art. So I think, by his standards, programming is definitely art. I think that's pretty cool. But here's the most important thing in this book, in my mind, that was really useful to me, is the path to a great artist, right? And so everyone who does any kind of art progresses in this scale, right? And they progress from 6 to 1. And so my notes are being covered by a clock. So as we get better, we start from 6. We learn how to just make something work, right? We want to make it compile. And maybe then we get a little better and start getting towards 5 and 4. We start learning how we should create something, right? How things should be structured, right? And then we start to learn like why things are structured the way they are, like understanding the past and understanding how things are built and how to fit in within that system, right? Or maybe not fit in with that system. Maybe making intentional choices on when to reinvent something from first principles instead of kind of following what people do before. And so as you get better and better, you start to move towards 4 or 3. And then you get to 2 and 1. This is very important. So he says from there, you can go one of 2 places, right? The first way is you can use code as a means to an end, right? So you can use your skill or your ability to write something to change the world outside of programming or design or, if you really think about that, programmers really have a lot of power these days, right? We have more effect on what the world sees than anything else, right? Television is dead, the phone is dead, everything is on the internet, and we build the internet. We can use our abilities, along with people like designers, and to do really amazing things. We can change the world, right? We can make the world a different place than it was before. It's really powerful. And I think a lot of people don't realize that. So there's something else you could do, right? You could also dive into the art itself, right? You can try to re-express how we build software, right? You could write a completely different way of creating applications than anyone else does, right? You could rethink how people do what they do, right? How should people build things in like 5 years or 10 years, right? What will make C# obsolete? What will make Git seem like old and boring, right? If you can think of it, you can build it, right? You're changing how others build solutions. So, and a lot of people go between these things. They might artists during their lifetime go between doing art for art's sake and doing art to tell a story or to do affect change, right? So you really owe it to yourself to ask, what do you want to do in the world? Like, what's your goal? What's your mission, right? And so you can kind of separate this, like, not what your practical mission is. What is your mission? Like, what do you want to do? And then once you can say that, you can say, well, what do I need to get there, right? So I think that not only individuals should have a mission, companies should have a mission too. So this is Kyle Neath, is our director of design at GitHub. And he really changed how I thought about what GitHub does when he said that this is the philosophical question that GitHub tries to solve, which is, what is the best way to write software? This is what 150 people think about all day. What is the best way that we together should write software? And so we think about this a lot, like in a bunch of different ways. Like, I work on native applications on Windows, and so me and the Mac guys think a lot about what's the best way to write native software that runs on the desktop. So this is the statement that we came up with. This is GitHub's mission. Working together is better than working alone. So if this isn't true, we need to make it true. This is our goal. We should make it so that working alone is actually less convenient than working with other people. And that's what we try to do. So this is really relevant because, so this is Clay Shirky. He's a famous internet blogger, and he says something that I found really poignant and I thought really interesting. So he says that everything is marketing. Like everything that's interesting is marketing. So he says marketing, it doesn't mean like advertisements, right? It means like trying to find an audience for an idea and have them understand that idea, right? And so his phrase for that was, ideas that spread win, right? So ideas that aren't shared with anyone don't go anywhere. Even if you do the work to create code or write a program or write a library that's the best library in the world, you have to share it with people. And that's like almost the more work, right, is sharing it with other people and making sure they understand it and making sure that working with other people to build something together. So I'm almost done. You're this close to beer, like right there. But I want to leave you one last thing from Steve Jobs. No, not that Steve Jobs. There we go. This Steve Jobs. So this is fake Steve Jobs, and it was a blog written by Daniel Lyons. He was the senior editor of Forbes magazine. He contributed to Newsweek. And it's one of my favorite articles in all of the internet is a post he wrote called A Not So Brief Chat with Randall Stephenson. So Randall Stephenson is the CEO of AT&T. And so you have to remember, like way back in the day when the iPhone first came out, in the US, AT&T was the only carrier. So it was either AT&T or you don't have an iPhone. So a lot of people say this phrase, like, change the world. And they say it so much that it's not really even motivating anymore. And so he did this really good job of explaining what change the world meant. And so I'll read an abridged version that doesn't involve him swearing at AT&T. Oh, okay, so you were born in 1960. So maybe you don't remember Meet the Beatles, or do you? Do you remember that album? Came out in the beginning of 1964. The one with 4 guys in black and white, half their faces white, half in shadow. Just 4 faces against a black backdrop. Now, the thing about that album was, on the day that hit the US, the whole world changed. Like, before that day, the world was one way, music was one way, culture was one way. And then after that day, the world was never ever the same again. And as soon as you heard that album, you knew that. And even if you're only a little kid, which he was, you just knew. You knew. Sales were crazy. Nuts. The thing was a huge smash hit. By April, 12 weeks after the album came out, they had the top 5 spots in the Billboard chart. All 5. So it wasn't like this rock album was the first rock album ever. Right? It wasn't like nobody ever made a band with some guitars and drums before. But it was radical. It was new. They took old forms and made them new. Same with the iPhone. They didn't invent the smartphone or the PDA or the music player or the web browser. They just made them better. They made them new. And they changed the world. You can't imagine the world before to the world now. It seems weird. It seems bizarre, like it doesn't exist. So, go change the world. Thank you.